might have met her yet. She's the curator for Make the Most, and so we're delighted to invite her back. And I think you're going to introduce the other contributors to today.
Right. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. I think this is going to be about an hour long. We've structured it as an in-conversation, so it's not people sort of presenting at you, so hopefully it's fairly informal. And I'll leave a space at the end for people to chip in questions, so if you have them gathering as we talk, then please do save them up and we'll give you a chance to ask some questions or come into the discussion towards the end. So very much like to introduce from that side, Chris Berridge, who works for Harvey Stone and was one of our supplier partners, if you like. And Thomas Appleton, who's come up from London today, and Laura Youngson-Cole, who's also come up from today or yesterday. So Chris is very much a kind of local, Somerset local in terms of where he works and operates, and Thomas and Laura have come sort of new to this place and responded, they've responded through their work here. I've just done a slideshow because of course Laura, Ellen Bacon and Maeve Clancy and Gary Olsen, who are the other artists, can't be with us today, but I wanted to represent them and feel like they were here in spirit. So the slideshow is images from the suppliers, because I felt I wanted their presence here very much today as well. It's very much been a partnership. And as we were doing site visits around these wonderful places and people and factories and suppliers in Somerset, it was just very special and really interesting and very evocative going into their premises. And you can't help but want to take photos and record it and really listen to what they say. So it gives you a flavour for how we all sort of arrived and went on site visits. And then I've tried after each supplier to sort of show the artist's process of it and what the artist produced. So I'll just let that tick over while we're talking. But I just wanted to say by way of introduction really that Somerset Art Works and Carol in particular and myself, when we were thinking about how we would construct a curatorial framework for this, Carol knew she wanted the exhibition here and had set up that partnership, and also felt something very particular to say about Somerset, whilst at the same time positioning craft as it should be in the 21st century, really give some really great examples of what makers operating today can do with materials, but also within their practice. How can they expand the language? What are they doing? What are they making? How can they do that in this place? And then secondly, the building, I don't know if you has everyone had a chance to, do you know the building? You've been around the exhibition, a chance to have a look. The building, it is a very crafted building. It has an amazing history, but then also Lyle's collection of wood panelling that you see in the house, and him working with the architect in his time to reconstruct the inside and have craftsmen, sort of repair the building and build new sections of. So it's a very crafted building that we felt as we went around and wanted to capture that craftsmanship, sort of bring it to light, but do that through placing contemporary work in the space. And so we constructed a framework really where we decided to pair contemporary artists with 5 suppliers who Carol sought out, and sort of we made a long list and then arrived at 5. So that was willow, stone, leather, paper and wood, all of which is available locally. So it's a chance to just also reflect on traditional skills, artisan skills, contemporary skills, digital skills. We've got a whole range of things that the exhibition encompasses, which I think is really nice. And the National Trust had a document that's called Spirit of Place, which I think the whole National Trust is kind of really thinking about mention the Somerset Treasures. So in addition to the 5 commissioned artists that we invested in, new commissions of work and invested in their time to come and really respond, we selected existing work from 6 artists in Somerset who we felt were exemplars of local, the best of local craftsmanship, and who sometimes maybe, they're all very established, all operating outside of Somerset, some of them internationally, and sometimes a maker where they're based, sometimes they operate miles away from where they're based, and they're well known outside of that, and not always appreciated where they're based. So the whole part of the exhibition was appreciation of craft, in all its forms, and particularly craft in relation to the place. So hence the 6 Somerset Treasures. Okay, so we've talked earlier this week, I think it was, and came up with a few strands and themes that we'd like to address really, which take us through all of our thoughts in making this exhibition happen. So the first one I wanted to ask was really about routes to making, and get a sense from each of you about to let the audience kind of know, where you're coming from, who you are in a sense. So if I can ask you all about your, just briefly, your route to making.
So I've always made stuff from a very early age, and it was always much better in 3 dimensions than 2 dimensions. Composing space, much better on 2-dimensional plane. So I did a sculpture degree and a sculpture master's degree. And during that time, I started working for a bookbinder. Quite coincidentally, actually, it's a sort of happy accident. And from then, I started to learn traditional leatherwork skills. So it was just an entirely different approach to making, because a lot of my fine art, in my fine artwork, you would come up with a concept, and you'd maybe have an idea in your mind's eye, and then you would find the materials to realise that work. So with the leather work, it was very much learning a skill first, a technique first. And eventually I got to the point where I wanted to sort of take that back into my sculptural work. So it's quite interesting that the emphasis was shifted, and material and process was much more integrated into sort of realising the ideas that I was having.
Well, unlike Laura, I'm not from a fine art background, and perhaps a bit like Chris, have come from a quite traditional masonry qualification route. I think there are different ways of working with stone, but they were all quite allied. And so my route to making was to kind of do the formal qualification, works on kind of restoration and heritage projects and masonry projects. But for me, working with stone is I suppose, a way for me to kind of express ideas and explore ideas. And after doing kind of my formal qualification, I then worked with a lot of letter carvers and people who were really experienced in using a mallet and a chisel to put an inscription in a piece of stone. And it's kind of one of the areas of carving, and it's the area that I chose to specialise in. So having done my formal qualifications and then worked alongside a lot of leading and established letter carvers, I established my own practice as a maker.
I started out, basically I didn't really have a route that I wanted to go down while I was at school, and I knew I enjoyed sort of geometry, maths and things like that, and I did stonemasonry as a week's work experience when I was in school, and I sort of fell in love with it then, and being able to sort of get your sort of tension out or whatever on the stone, and seeing it as I sort of saw it then as it could be a career that I can enjoy, and it's not something that you're trapped in an office for a certain amount of hours. It's very sort of freeing, and so then I went on and did an apprenticeship, same as Tom, in stonemasonry, and I didn't really feel that I was sort of at my end then. I didn't feel I was sort of a trained mason as such, so I did an extra course called the conservation course down in Weymouth, which sort of taught me to respect old buildings basically, which, you know, at that age I was still kind of, I could do masonry, but it was just a way of working. So that really taught me then how to sort of put my skills into keeping old buildings going. And that's sort of, how I got to where I am. But we're very similar, me and Tom, in the sense of stonemasonry it's not as sort of set guidelines as other trades can be, where everything has to be sort of dead perfect. You still have a bit of an artistic license, even if you're carving windows, things like that. There's still the tooling to sort of keep into, you know, it sort of is your own to do what you like with, so that's why I'm doing this.
And how long was do you have the same length of apprenticeships? 3 years.
Yeah, so like a formal qualification, and then alongside that work on various projects, so you're applying skills that you've learned.
And did you do your apprenticeship with Harvey Stone?
Yeah. So I left school and Saul had offered me a job up there for when I'd left school, and nothing really else had sort of jumped out at me, so I went for that, and we did 3 years up at Bath, or sort of, it's kind of month on, month off, up at Bath and then back at work, and you can sort of apply, as you say, the skills you learn at college to real life, and then sort of the other way around. You can take what you've learned at work, say shortcuts or tricks of the trade, and take them back to college and spread your knowledge with other people and get tricks off them as well. So
and it's a model which means that you're working alongside other, I always get this word wrong, apprentices. So that I think some apprenticeships is very much you're in an organisation, kind of almost in isolation, or maybe with another apprentice. But what's great about this model is you do, as Chris says, you get to learn from other peers going through the same programme, which I think for a heritage craft like ours is really vital, because every stone is work differently depending on its own makeup. And so part of the great thing for me about working with other stonemasons is that you've got to say, okay, well, you're working a lot with a stone from this part of the world. I need to know if I'm doing it that York stone works like this, whereas Lincoln is like this, or so you get to share that kind of practical knowledge as well.
Talking about other parts of the world, Chris, tell us about you have ventured out into the world a bit more.
When I was at college, we competed in competitions, that sort of something they do in colleges to promote excellence in work, accuracy, things like that. That's what it's sort of set on, is accuracy of carving. And I did well in the college competitions, so I went and carved, did national competitions, did well then, and was put through a training programme after my Weymouth course, for another probably nearly 18 months, training on and off around the country with all sorts of people up at York Minster and carvers in Penrith, and to sort of hone my skills to then compete at an international competition against sort of French and Koreans. So there was one from each country that competed. It was an under 23 competition, so it wasn't anybody could go. And I got gold there. So.
That makes you a world masters, don't you?
Well, yeah. For my age.
Well, it's interesting, I mean, just kind of that it
you see how other stonemasons around the world work, and you'd think they're crazy if one of them come over and started working something like, what on earth are you doing? But these are the most accurate of their age in masonry as well. So every country had their completely different way of working things. It's only really us and the French that seem to work things similar. But yeah, the accuracy was always there. And at college, you're taught this is the way you have to do it. It's all very stricken. That sort of taught me that as long as it looks right at the end, you can sort of have freedom to do as you wish, which makes it more artistic.
It's good that there's such a structured apprenticeship scheme. So I think within bookbinding, a lot of my colleagues have done sort of book art degrees, and they were saying that there's either an emphasis on the conceptual side or the technical side, and you don't get a good mix. So they were actually coming to the workshop that I work in to learn the technical side. Too many ideas in technical skills. I'm not aware of apprenticeships as such in that area anymore, so it's great to hear in stonework.
It's coming back slowly round, isn't it? It's coming back round.
I think it's looked after. Just generally, this country is very, I don't know, they just love stonework for some reason as a trade, and we can't let it die out, and because it's sort of on the brink, there aren't loads of us in that way. They like to try to bring it back if they can, so keep it going.
Okay, we'll move on to really explore the commission a bit more and how people responded to that. We asked each artist to really introduce them to their supplier, and they did a site visit to Barrington Court here and met staff and had some information tour around here, and then went off to see their supplier. And the idea was that we'd try and start a relationship, have a dialogue. The main thing was dialogue and an exchange. And so there were two sort of responses that the artists needed to make, really. A response to this place and to the history of Barrington, but also to what they would see and experience at the supplier. So I just wanted to ask you really then how you, having done the site visits, how you then responded, what your observations were, and how you responded.
I was initially drawn to the gardens here because a lot of my work is about sort of human intervention in our environment, and I thought, especially on a very sort of small scale, I thought the gardens were very indicative of that, how we form our environment and how a lot of us connect to nature in contemporary times. And I also thought that the gardens here, with their sort of arts and crafts heritage, and were a very good example of the craft of shaping our environment as well in itself. This extraordinary head gardener, Christine here. So I was thinking about our representation of nature in an arts and crafts theme, how we bring that into the domestic as well. And I was also looking very, very struck by all the Lyle's collection, sort of eclectic collection of panelling here, and all the sort of the strange carvings in the long gallery that are kind of this naive sort of almost graffiti. And then on the main door there's these extraordinary carvings of these sort of mythological animals, and the kind of the fact that the archive of those have been lost, the provenance of a lot of that panelling is unknown, kind of adds to the mythology of it. I quite like that idea. I was also thinking about there's a lot of panelling in the shop, and I think it's attributed to Christopher Wren, but they're not sure. Because again they've lost the archives. And one of his carvers was this guy called Grinling Gibbons, great name. But he depicted things in wood he would carve flora and stuff, so it was so fine that it was said to sort of shake when you walk past. It looked so ephemeral, but it was made of wood. So I really like the idea of using material, an unlikely material, and I sort of want to express that in my leather work as well. Which is why I ended up using vellum, because I use a technique called pairing, so you can pare it down very, very thinly with a scalpel, and it becomes almost translucent, and then you can sculpt with it. That's a sort of variation on the bookbinding technique. And I like that idea of almost sort of subverting the aesthetic of what you expect leather to be. I don't think people expect it to be so ephemeral. When we went to Burfield Gloves, I was sort of thinking about that, and they use a lot of hair sheep leather, which is a sheep from Ethiopia, and it's hair sheep because it doesn't need wool because it's very hot there. But it's very, very fine leather again. I'm used to using bookbinding leathers, which is a goat skin, which is fine again, but the hair sheep leather is a bit softer, so they use it to mould the gloves and stuff. So I was kind of looking at these scraps when we were looking around Burfield and thinking, looking at the colours and thinking, what would happen if I paired a little scrap of this, and how could I integrate that into the work? So they gave me a big bag of scraps to take away, which is great to experiment with, and just find out, because I'm used to working in the goatskin bookbinding leathers, how the hair sheep would behave. So I was also struck just by the amazing skills of the people there, and this idea of having to do these often repetitive and laborious tasks over years and years and days, but that's how you really learn the properties of a material and how it behaves. And we were watching the glove stretcher, and he's stretching the gloves ready to cut them, and it just seems to have this innate knowledge of how the leather behaves. It's kind of doing it so quickly. I was thinking about that as well in the work. I was also thinking about all the tools they were using, and a lot of them they've had since the 40s when the business was first set up, and they still use them. They're still good, and they get engineers to adapt bits of them if they need to change the designs. But I was just thinking that thing about having hand tools, and that meaning that you do again have a direct association with the material that you're working with, and a direct, you're feeling it, you're kind of interacting with it very directly. So in some of the leather work stuff that I do for interiors, they start to use laser machines to cut the leather, and it's just a completely different process, because you're not sculpting the leather, you're not pairing it, you're not gouging it, you're not interacting with it. So I was very aware at Burfields that process of interacting with the material is still going on.
Do you want to just mention briefly the questionnaires idea, the thing that you did?
Well, I was going to describe the two different pieces. I don't know if you've seen the White Garden piece. It's like the allium form, which is made of vellum, and then the detailing on that is from Burfields, the scraps that Burfield gave me. So there's coloured details which form the anthers of the plants.
Can I just ask you what vellum is?
It's parchment. Do you know parchment? It's a goat skin, the vellum I use. But it's not, as leather is tanned, it's not tanned, it's cured, so it's sort of stretched and then scraped with a hemispherical knife. And that process is repeated and repeated and repeated, so you end up with a very fine skin. They used to use it as paper in manuscripts, and so they would do illuminated manuscripts on it. And there's quite a history of watercolour painting on it, because it gives that sort of translucent quality to the paint. So it's beautiful material. And when it's paired very, very thinly, it becomes translucent, which I was thinking about with the placing of that piece as well that's in the window, because then the light shines through it, you get sort of different subtle effects. So I wanted to integrate lots of different ideas into that piece, because I was looking at the plant forms from the garden, I was looking at the carvings and the panelling, and I wanted to bring something of Burfield's into that as well. So I sent questionnaires to some of the makers there, and just asking about their favourite aspects of the making, and when they thought they'd done their apprentice, when they thought they really knew about how the leather behaved in an intuitive way, how long that took. And based on those, I made a little component for each maker. So, for instance, the basic structure of it was some sort of glove patterns that I cut from vellum. And then when they were glued and sculpted, they came into a sort of flower shape. So, and then each one was personalised to a maker. So, one woman was talking about the pointing on the back of the glove. She specialised in that, which is sort of decorative sewing effect. And she drew me all these beautiful diagrams of this pointing. So I made that in the vellum, and that was the sort of the anther of the flower. So look out for those. But yeah, I wanted to sort of make all those things into a cohesive form, which is why I used the allium form, which I thought was quite a recognisable form. And people seem to spy it from the corridor, and they're like, oh, it's a giant allium, and then it sort of brings them in closer, so then you can look at the detail bits.
Shall we move on to Tom?
Yes.
All the time we can come back to the other piece.
Mm-hmm.
Your response to the commission, to the challenge?
Yes, I think Barrington's really unusual as a property in that it's not furnished. And you're very much aware of the structure of the building, which is made, on especially like a day like today, it just glows, this hamstone just glows. And, this is a Tudor building, Tudor Elizabethan building, so although we could drive up with the truck and our plinths and bits of stone, that wasn't available to the people that made this building, who made it at a time when stonemasons were also architects, so the people who designed the building also worked on the building. And again, so little is known of who those makers were. At the time of making, in a way that you saw kind of the pictures of the people at their banks of sewing machines, masons used to be called banker masons, which I think from the French for bench, used to work at a table. And so my understanding is that if you're in a room with several people making, if you're working on, sills or mullions and windows, and several of you doing the same piece, when you carve your piece, you put your mason's mark on it. And at the end of the day, the foreman can go through it, okay, Chris, you've made 10, Tom's made 3, well. And that would affect what you got paid. So mason's marks are just very kind of quick strikes in the stone to say, okay, you got made, that's what you get paid. And when we had our first meeting here, Christine, who runs the Property for the National Trust, said, some of our volunteers have been involved in documenting these mason's marks. And I'm like, this is fantastic. Because it's very rare that they're so present in the building. And what is extra fantastic is that the marks that are found here are also found at other local properties where we know that those masons worked, or where they worked in Oxford. So there's a chap called Peter Hill's done a lot of work to kind of trace where these makers have been and what they've been involved in making. And so for me that was like a real kind of opportunity to respond, because the tools, the hand tools I use haven't changed since Roman times. It is a mallet, it's a chisel, it's really not that technical. So it's kind of an opportunity for me to use those skills again in the way that the makers that worked on Barrington would have as well. So kind of the first kind of area of response was to kind of think about actually who made this building. And the quarry as well has like a phenomenal history and connection with its past. I mean, it's been worked, I think the stone has been worked since Iron Age times. It's very part of the lease for the quarry today is, as I understand it, to keep buildings like Barrington alive, and so because so much of the local architecture in this region uses hamstone, that they're kind of a vital resource to make sure that we can keep these incredible buildings up and here for generations to come. So when we're working with stone, we're working with something that's millions of years old, and I know Chris can talk you through kind of the nature of the stone itself and how you work it at the quarry. But my response was really to think about the people that would have worked at Barrington whose names are lost. But also to kind of celebrate the stone itself, because we're used to seeing stone in an external context, but I think it's a very powerful and potent material in itself, and hamstone is just stunning. If you're from this area, you're lucky to have one of the most beautiful native stones that we have in the UK on your doorstep.
Can I just ask you how it differs from other stones that you've worked with?
Well, stones, there's a few characteristics that make working a piece of stone different, I suppose. Is kind of its beds. If it's hamstone's quite beddy, it's has weaknesses running through beds and has harder beds and things like that. So you have to be very conscious of the way you're working the stone. Also, then where it's going in the wall. If it's a window, you need the beds to sort of run naturally as they would, so that the stone doesn't fall apart as the weather gets it, as it sort of freezes and things like that. So whereas other stones, things like sort of Portland, is very free, I think to call it freestone, because you can almost work it however you like. No matter sort of how you treat it, it will do what you want it to. Technically, whereas hamstone, you could hit it that way and this bit over here comes off, and so you've got to be very sort of aware of your stone, try and be at one with your stone.
Yeah, and it's a sedimentary limestone, so literally layers that have got squashed. And when we talk about bed, it's the kind of layers. So like looking at the side of the page of the book, and so the depth of bed is kind of like how much. The kind of maximum height you can get from a bed height. It's set by the stone. So part of the challenge that I gave to the quarry was to say, well, I want plinths that are going to be 1 metre high. We knew that would be informed by kind of the angle that the bed would be running, because the bed height is a certain depth.
It's quite technical then.
Well, it's just a number of things that you need to sort of think about as you work with stone.
Yeah.
The more you work with it, then the sort of more natural it just plinths that high, that shape need to be up like that.
Yeah.
So just things happen without you thinking about it, I suppose.
Yeah.
So Tom's going to come back to
Sure.
your next step then.
Yeah. I work a lot with reclaimed material because I think stone, when it's discarded, has a lovely kind of history of its own. So another kind of part of my project was having realised in a way that I wanted to celebrate the masons that had worked here. I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could do that on stone that had come from National Trust properties? So we then had conversations with the National Trust, and their kind of on-site stonemasons let us go to their yard and look through the stores to find stones that had been taken off National Trust buildings during kind of restoration work, that had sport or might have kind of delaminated or split through time, or just been weather worn, because 500 years or whatever it is long enough for anything to be exposed to elements, and to allow me to repurpose those. So to take not just the marks of the masons who had worked at Barrington, but to actually take the work that they'd produced. And when so much of it is high up or on a roof, it's nice to be able to position the stone where people can actually see it and walk around it. One of the pieces, which is the one on the left, which is a window header, very similar to those that are in the buttery as well. So it's kind of giving that real direct connection between the people that worked on the building, the heritage of the stone and how it was worked, and just to recite that in a new context.
There's a really lovely layering of narrative and story, and it was something that we really hoped for and Carol worked really hard with all of us to make it happen, because the National Trust were a bit dubious about whether they could let somebody reuse the stone and do something else with it. But I thought it really made sense of your tribute to the masons, and also it just added another layer of history to put this very contemporary mark on it, which was really lovely. Chris, from your point of view, from the supplier end of things, how did it feel having Tom come into the yard and have, specify and start to have a dialogue with you about what he was doing?
You can very much kind of get lost when you're working in just the sort of day-to-day, stone comes in, you work it, stone goes out, stone comes in, you work it. So sort of, when Tom came in and sort of sparks that, the thoughts of, I'm doing this because of that, and every little detail has a reason for, every little thing has a reason for sort of why it's being done. It sort of, it does fuel people that work there, thinking, there's history to what we're doing, and there's kind of, there's sort of art to it, and it does make you think about what you're doing is a great thing for people having a look, and for the country and stuff like that.
Something I wanted to come back to, I think Laura's touched on, you all touched on this bit, but a bit more about sort of process, materials, skills, and that language of making. What I was really interested in when I went with Laura to the to Burfields to do the site visit was just how she immediately, felt like a bit of a gooseberry at times. She immediately connected with Matthew, the director there, and it was the materials that was really exciting. Both of them, they both from different perspectives knew this material of leather, really well, and so I could see there was both a shared language, which was quite interesting, around materials and materiality and ways of working with leather, but then also a departure in some ways, because skill is very wide, and the way of practicing and using that material, way of applying that material was where it sort of became different, which was quite interesting. There was a whole language he was using. I don't know if you've noticed, but beside each information panel in the exhibition, we've got a little book that we made, and in there we've tried to capture the words, because as we were going around, I was listening to Matthew talking about the leather, and he was using all these words that were very specific to that trade, and in fact, probably at the yard, and so we collected all these words from the willow growers and from the wood yard, and just wonderful words that aren't actually common parlance, but they're being kept alive, and they're all to do with the language of making. They're being kept alive by these suppliers because they're still alive and being used. There were some great words that Matthew came up with, weren't there? And then your language about, they use that cutting, they call it a cutting tool. You've seen an image of the cutting tool, which is, they call that a knife, and it doesn't look like a knife I've ever seen, but it's a knife. And then Laura uses a scalpel, and they wouldn't think of using a scalpel to work with leather. So it's something about language and process would be quite interesting. So what did you observe about how process and making was the same or different?
I think could probably equate the making of the glove factory more to bookbinding or the furniture making that I do for bookbinders. I also do a lot, we do decorative effects furniture, but using a lot of traditional bookbinding techniques, which have been adapted for that. And in that respect, as with the glove making, when you're stretching the gloves, you have to get the right grain direction of the leather, otherwise they stretch too much. In furniture making or in bookbinding, you have to do a similar thing where you take the correct bit of leather. And because it's this different language that builds up around that. And then I think in my sculptural work, it's sort of experimenting with that a bit more and taking those, using that that language and that knowledge as a basis, but then taking it into other, or just onto a more experimental basis. But I was thinking that there was also that thing of process, and just that you have to do your time in that respect. If you want to learn these skills, you can, and sometimes it's very laborious, isn't it? It's very kind of repetitive, but then you've got these extraordinary skills that you can use and take into different arenas.
It was interesting how the guy that Laura was explaining about, and how he had a ruler there, but he wasn't really using it. He knew exactly, he was doing a size 10 glove or something, he knew exactly how to stretch it by feel, and it was just an amazing, that deep tacit knowledge was just amazing to see, wasn't it? You just can't take it for granted. It's sort of learned over practice and years, and amazing to see him stretch it just by the right amount, because he could, it would be wrong. And Matthew just kept saying to us again and again, to make a glove, it has to, fit and sort of function with your hand really carefully. So it's all very sort of careful, but then how you sort of, it's the same material, but Laura's used it so differently from the way he had to make a very glove to a very specified, a high standard, a specification, and the limitations of that. Although it's a beautiful object, it's still beautifully highly crafted, but it's very specified. And then you see Laura's work, and she's used that very same material, but there's a kind of, your creative sensibility is taking on a different journey, and motivation for what you want to get out of that material in that process is very different.
But I think I wonder, on the one hand, there's that satisfaction of making something to specification extremely well, and just seeing the tangible result of that, incredible in itself. I think it's.
It just reminded me when I was training to be a letter carver, I got to learn to draw by this guy called Richard Kindersley, who is a phenomenally experienced letter carver. I used to sit in his attic and draw alphabets, but with no reference material. Drawing like a very particular letter form, which we call Trajan letters. And so I'd draw them, and he'd come and tell me, no, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And it's a really slow process. One day I did numbers, and I went home. I was like, I did 3 numbers. What do you do? I did 1, 2, and 3. This was like phenomenal when I moved on. But I said to Richard, how will I know when they're not? How will I know when the letters are right? And he said, well, they will tell you. And at the time, it was the most frustrating bit of feedback ever, because obviously they weren't telling me. But now I know. It's that conscious competence. You just know, and you know straight away when they're wrong as well. You know. So, but because it's done by eye, letters are spaced by eye. You can't. When you do it on a computer, everything dies straight away. And it is that.
Something with the laser cutting.
Yeah. You just have that. I suppose stretching to the right size glove. I just know that letter is that form, and if it's not, you kind of know where it should go.
Sorry, I also wonder about the sort of happy accidents that have happened within that process as well, because, and quite apart from sort of experimenting very deliberately, I think within that process there must be development within that process that just happens by accident, which is.
It's. I think and once you know the rules, you can choose to work them differently. As though kind of European masons work differently, but they have rules. And when you're working outside the rules, you've still got that starting point. It's kind of you need to know the right notes before you can play the wrong ones, because it has to be informed by moving away from somewhere. I think if you were just to go in isolation, it doesn't quite work. So although I wasn't carving letters for this piece, it's exactly the same principles. where we took the stone from the stores here, and then there's a picture of Saul at the quarry when we cut into them. So until we cut into them, we had no idea what was going to be inside, if the stone was going to be workable, if it had been, sometimes if they're pinned with metal, they start to rot over time. So it wasn't until we cut into them we knew that the stone was going to be solid to work with. So that was a good day. And this is going to go to plan. But then the principle's the same. And I chose to paint the carving partly to stand out, but in the fireplaces here, and this is an example, you'll see that with the heat, the stone turns red. And so it's, as well as kind of celebrating the masons and marks themselves are going to bring them to life, it's also something that naturally happens with the stones to have that colour. So it's kind of, again, it has kind of iron oxide that runs through the stone, and it's just kind of another way to kind of reference the material itself.
Chris, anything to add?
I think so.
A day in the life of the young?
But yeah, well, up at the yard we do sort of everything in the stone process, from quarrying the stone, put that back.
And the quarry's right next to it.
It's literally, we're on the quarry. So they'll pull it up out of the ground, and depending on the job, you take it into the saws. Got the one big saw that cuts it up, passes it to the smaller saws, the secondary saws, and then they cut the specific size blocks for masons to carve into windows or sort of whatever's needed, really.
How many staff are there at the quarry?
There's 13 of us now, I think. But there's only 3 masons, and you don't really get sort of. There are a couple sort of big firms out there, but I wouldn't say there's that many large firms anymore, really.
There's not. I'm in London. There's not a banker shop inside the M25. And the larger stones, the larger firms will tend to work on restoration jobs and then kind of staff up when they need them. And that's when you tend to get a lot of masons working together. But in terms of stone yard having on site, it's less than it was, but it's still there.
You mentioned skill in relation. One of you mentioned computers and digital, and so I thought I'd just mention, as Gary isn't here, that I mean we're really pleased that that we have that spectrum of making represented in the exhibition. So we do have hand skill, traditional hand skill, but also contemporary hand skill and tacit knowledge that comes from all directions. But I think it's important to say that Gary's work as well, which is all digital, uses a digital milling machine. So he is designing on the computer, but you'll see from some of the slides that went through the things that he was inspired by, the herringbone floors, the bits of decorative sort of tiling that come up, the bits of decorative elements around the building, and particularly the linen fold, the wooden panelling, that's the famous linen fold pattern. And you can really see when in his work those references. But he has taken probably about 7 years to learn this, how to, not only how to use the milling machine, but actually as an artist, how to disrupt it, how to, from mistakes, because artists are kind of learning how to use things, but often it's the mistakes that happen that most interest artists. So somebody who is using it for an industrial purpose would say, oh no, it's a mistake, do it again, we'll have to, it doesn't look good, it's got to be like, it's not how it should be. But an artist would look at it and say, actually, that's made a really interesting surface, that's made it so digital. It's just important to think in this context today, whilst we're sitting in a fantastic heritage building, heritage craft skills, that digital has become part of a maker's toolbox in the 21st century. It's not something that's separate from hand skill. There's still a lot of skill and knowledge that one needs to have to use these tools and incorporate them into your practice. So there's a combination. And Gary still has to know a lot about the wood, how it behaves. So he took away some fallen planks from Barrington and also from his wood yard, so that the piece is made up of both, half and half. And he had to do loads of tests, hundreds of tests just to see how that material behaved. You know, one from the yard behaved very differently from the one from Barrington. So there's a lot, you know, the exhibition is very much about skill, I think, isn't it, and from way back and from now. But another thing just to touch on was I was fascinated by thinking, you know, because we've had a chance here to really focus on the county of Somerset and Somerset. It was fascinating to just acknowledge really that we still have in this country a fantastic resource of this county still has a craft ecology, and we try to sort of unpick that a little bit through this exhibition, both in pairing, the very fact of pairing the artist with a supplier meant that we kind of had a chance to highlight 5 suppliers who actually are all about 3rd or 4th generation family run businesses, and it just sort of made me realise how much really the craft ecology is very interdependent on things. It contributes to the economy here, but for example the willow growers have their tools handmade by blacksmiths down the road. So if there wasn't a blacksmith still down the road, you know, the chain in the process of things, you know, maybe wouldn't be as strong. They're then employing a very crafted, knowledgeable process to how they grow and treat the willow, you know, process it, and they're then handing it on to artists like Laurel and Bacon to do something amazing to transform that material. And then as well as supplying local basket makers and things like that. So I think there's a wonderful kind of you know, a range of employment going on there. There's a wonderful relationship going on there. I think it's really important, you know, to the ecology here. So and the sense, you get a real sense that the land has kind of shaped what crafts can be you know, made and done here. So without the Somerset levels, you wouldn't be able to grow the willow. Without James's essay in Catalogue sort of describes how the tanneries came about, how it came to be a good place for tanneries because of the people, you know, grazing for cattle, but then also how people could drove their cattle to a certain place, and so tanneries came up, and hence the gloving, and you know, because of the rivers and streams, it was good for paper mills, and so they're still doing. So all of that, I think, I found it really fascinating. So how have you responded to coming to this place, and what we've been able to say about the place in this exhibition?
I think you touched on earlier about kind of paying tribute, really. And Hamstone is only found here. It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful material to work with. There's nowhere else this project could have happened, really. And I kind of think in the history of the material, and something that's that old, whatever I do has to be pretty light touch and respectful, really. And I think it is that kind of paying tribute to all those different facets of the place, the people, the tools that have been used, the work that's gone into, you know, I've taken something and I've put it on the saw and cut it up, but that was someone's work, and so all very kind of much respecting the connections that link all these things together. And it was really apparent that in the, you know, talking to Richard, who's the Native for National Trust, or John, who's the volunteer here, both had grandparents that worked at the quarries, and there's a real connection between that quarry as a local employer and generations that are still here. And it for me, really important that forms part of what, as a maker, in responding to the brief, encompassing that project.
Yeah, I think that's one of my other pieces combines some gloves that Burfield made, some beautiful gloves, and I've made lichen forms on the surface of them, which are taken from the grounds and gardens here. And I quite like the idea of lichens as a sort of indicator species, so they're kind of a broader look at the ecology here. And so that was quite, I think on a broader scale, it's amazing as you've got everything from the sort of Shatwick marshes and very, very early human intervention in our environment to the gardens here, you know, and to the agricultural world that facilitated the tanneries and stuff. think I was actually referencing mostly on a smaller scale, like how the house reflects our kind of move inside, and then how the arts and crafts movement sort of thought, oh, now we have to bring the outside inside because we're missing it. So it's kind of reflecting it in little ways like that. And also Christine's amazing garden. The gloves fit Christine, the head gardener here, because I thought her work was so incredible here.
So it's sort of a tribute to her.
Yeah, so it's a tribute to her.
Chris, place, are you from Somerset? Born in Somerset?
No, I was born in Huntingdon, and my dad was in RAF, so I've been sort of posted around everywhere. But as far as I've been here now since I was 11, I think, and it's very much a big part of being around. In the countryside, it's traditional things and local things are important to the people around here, I think.
It's kind of anyone who's driven around and seen the Millennium Stones that the quarry made for a lot of the villages around here. So there's lots of examples of kind of the work that
used locally. But I mean, Hamstone goes quite far anyway. I mean, as far as sort of building work, we've done big projects down in London. Hampstead Court, there's the University College School there.